So I could make a lame and terrible pun about this movie, saying, "Oh, this movie is so terrible. This how terrible is it?" Well, you know what? I'm not gonna do that because one, I don't want to waste a shitty pun on such a shitty movie, and two, everything else about this movie is so cliched and so predictable that you probably expected that. You probably expected me to say something like something, like a pun, like how terrible this movie is. Well, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to rant about this movie for a little bit. So, Tarot is a brand new horror movie that's playing in theaters right now and stars a bunch of dumb teenagers who find like this deck of tarot cards at this house they're renting out, and basically they read them off and learn like various disturbing things, and then they realize there are monsters that are going to kill them now because they used someone else's deck of tarot cards. So this is a movie that, yeah, I was not looking forward to this movie whatsoever. It looked like a movie that was like very similar to Ouija. Like, yikes, this movie does not want to be compared to Ouija. But yeah, it looked pretty terrible. It didn't look scary. It looked dumb. It looked really dumb. Even by dumb horror movie standards, this looked really dumb. And yeah, that's what I got. I got a really dumb horror movie. I got one of the lamest horror movies I've seen in a while. Awful. Just awful. Is there anything that's at least tolerable? The cards look interesting. And some of the monsters look pretty intimidating. And that's it. Everything else about this movie sucks. Every character in this movie is either extremely boring or extremely annoying. And they were just so I just could not care for any of them. Like, Jacob Batalon, who plays Ned in the Spider-Man movies, he's in this movie as the main comedic foil in this movie. And a lot of his jokes fall flat. Like, they are really bad. I did not care for anyone in this movie. They were all so generic, so boring. I don't even remember most of the characters' names after seeing the movie. I didn't care. I knew some of the situations that they were kind of in, but that's also because I remember these were in other horror movies. A lot of the stuff that's in this movie is just taken from other horror movies. I won't necessarily say good horror movies or great horror movies, but they were taken from other horror movies where it's like one of the main characters, when she talks about something in her past, it's like, oh, that was like this from this movie. Or when someone comes in and kind of helps them out, it's like, oh, that's kind of like this from this movie. It's just it's so cookie cutter. Like, I just felt like it was just a copy and pasted horror movie. It's like, okay, we'll take this from this movie. We'll take this from this movie. We'll just throw it all together. Okay, we have a movie now. Oh boy, it feels that way. It feels like it was just copy and pasted at times. It is that bad. Also, this movie's just not very scary. It is. Now, PG-13 horror movies, they get a bad rep sometimes. I feel like there are some really good, disturbing horror movies out there that just so happen to be PG-13. And what's weird about horror movies is that they can be pretty scary and pretty intimidating. Because, like, I've seen scarier PG-13 movies over scarier R movies, if I'm being honest. And there's some scary movies out there like Drag Me to Hell, which are still incredibly disturbing to me. Movies like The Ring are pretty creepy. Lights Out was pretty creepy to me. Quiet Place is a really good horror movie that just so happens to be PG-13. Insidious has a few scares in it that are pretty well done, and it's like, okay, but it just so happens to be PG-13. This movie, on the other hand, cuts away from a lot of the deaths in this movie. You can get away with a lot in a PG-13 movie, and this movie doesn't understand that. Like, there's one death in this movie that involves a ladder. So the camera actually pans up to have the ladder, like, stopping on someone, and it's like, they're not even showing blood, they're not showing, the action that's going on, they're just showing a ladder. Now, sometimes it's like, okay, you kind of want the mystery, there's like, what's happening? It's like, there is no mystery, though. There is no mystery about what is happening in this movie, because, like, we know what's happening. But this movie doesn't show anything. It's also so dimly lit, too. Like, this is one of the worst shot movies I've seen in a while. Like, you don't even get to see anything. You kind of just, like, it's just, everything's just shrouded in darkness. It's like, yeah, I get it. Horror movies are pretty dark and such, and they're pretty disturbing and such. But this movie is so dimly lit, like, I couldn't even tell what was even happening half the time. Oh, man. I did not like this movie. A lot of the deaths are just so boring. They cut away from a lot of it, and it's just kind of just so boring to me. And also, I kind of just thought of this movie too. This movie just feels very pandering. Like, this movie definitely feels like it's pandering to, like, a somewhat younger crowd to like kind of try to get them into horror and such, but like it doesn't really want to push that envelope of like trying to be like a very disturbing horror movie and such. This movie is like, they think it's like, oh, it's going to be one of those movies that, girls will probably watch their first sleepover. It's like, okay, this is a horror movie. We're going to put it in because, like, we're doing this. It's like, this movie is just very pandering, if I'm being honest. Like, this is a movie that feels like it rips off a bunch of other horror movies. Not necessarily great horror movies, but feels, better horror movies than this. Literally almost anything is better than this, and I'm going to make a comparison later. It's just so cliched. It is just so it's just so uninteresting. Like, everything about it is just so boring, annoying, predictable. It is just annoying. Like, I mentioned Abigail was a little predictable, but at least I kind of had fun with that movie. The movie had more than just, like, just the predictability factor to it. This movie just has nothing going for it. And I'm going to make a comparison that I honestly feel dirty while making it. This movie is worse than Imaginary and Night Swim. And I hated those movies. Those movies were incredibly stupid. I hated them. I really hated those movies. Like, Night Swim admittedly could have had a really fun premise, but they just took it in the wrong direction. Imaginary also could have been really fun, but it had some interesting world building. And again, it could have been really fun if it was really campy as well. But this movie is worse because not only is it also just as serious as those two movies are, not only is the comedy just falls flat, not only the horror, but just the fact that it just feels like it just borrows heavily from a bunch of other horror movies that it never really feels like its own thing. It never really feels like this movie is, interesting. It never feels funny or scary. It's not even like laughably bad. It is just a movie where it's like, it tries to entice you to think, oh, we're gonna, push the envelope and such, but it never really does that. It's a movie that I was not interested in going into it, so maybe that doesn't help me in this situation. But this movie is just so bad. It's just not scary, predictable, boring, and also here's how bad this movie was too. I had like a ton of caffeine before this movie too, and it knocked me out. This movie knocked me out. It was boring. So boring. That is the last thing a movie should be. No matter what. Whether it's a horror movie, or comedy, or action movie, or drama, whatever. The last thing a movie should be is boring. Yikes. This movie is just awful. It is... I keep repeating myself over and over again, but then again, this movie just repeats stuff from other, slightly better horror movies. Harrow is the worst horror movie I've seen so far this year. We're not even at the halfway point of the year, and, we still have, October, and we still have the fall coming up, so I just hope horror movies are better than this. And I just hope that, filmmakers understand, just because your movie's PG-13, that doesn't mean it's restricted in, actual scares and such, or actual, like, attempts to, like, be scary and over the top and bloody and violent and such. Because I've seen PG-13 movies that have terrified me and disturbed me because of how intense it was. And this movie doesn't get it. This movie doesn't get anything. So I'll give Tarot 0.5 out of 4 stars. Skip it. Yikes, I really hated this one. So, what is your least favorite horror movie of the year so far? Comment down below, subscribe to the channel. This is Pat. Stay safe.